Okay, good morning. We are at Battersea Park and the tide is low. The Thames is very low along the bed and I'm here with Paul KAYE. This is the Travelling Through podcast. I'm your host Emma and today's guest is Paul KAYE. Paul has lived, worked and travelled greatly in Europe. His love of languages took him to the European Union. He's a cross-country skier and he has also interpreted for Alex Ferguson of Manchester United. This is Paul's story about London, the world and life. Hello Paul.
Hi Emma, it's great to see you again.
Yeah, and you cycled from which direction to meet me?
I cycled from Kennington, so I think I've come the opposite direction from you.
You have. I've come from further down the river at Wandsworth, so about half an hour's cycle ride. But it's a bit of a misty, gloomy day after the weekend when it was really lovely, wasn't it?
Gorgeous, wasn't it?
Yeah. So which way shall we walk? Shall we just go up to the pagoda and wander around? I've never actually walked very far in Battersea Park. Do you know the park well?
I've spent a lot of time cycling around it in lockdown because it's within range of my bike for my daily exercise without going too far. So I've been around it quite a lot.
It gets very busy,
this last
doesn't
year.
It?
So it's been amazingly busy.
The summer was incredible.
Yes, it was.
Lockdown and everybody was here.
the first lockdown it was quite quiet when we were all taking it more seriously, I think, than the second and third lockdowns.
Yes.
And the second lockdown, when it was the sort of the end of summer and there was still some nice days, it was absolutely packed.
Yeah. But I suppose everybody's trying to get to, at least they are trying to get to the open spaces and enjoy a bit of nature and the open air and get the sunshine as well. So where people were limited to where they could go, in fact.
Yes, so. Exactly. And it's built up area around here, and it's must be one of the few places where you can get a bit of open space and feel a bit of freedom rather than being cooped up in a flat.
You can properly stretch your leg and stretch both your legs even. And, a lot of people go running around this park as well.
I've been stretching my left more than my right actually this lockdown. Yeah,
why is that?
I've got to address that really. It's something.
You've been going around the hills the wrong way. It's a Scottish thing. Anyway, I was trying to remember when we first met, and I'm pretty sure the shop had opened fairly recently, and I think it probably was a Saturday, because Saturday was generally the day you did come into the shop, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And you came up to me and said, "You've got an awful lot of Eastern European titles in the bookshop. Why is that?" And you caught me out. So I think you picked up a Kadari, I'm probably pronouncing the Albanian author's name incorrectly, but Ismail Kadari's book, I think it was The Three Elegies of Kosovo, and I had a couple of other titles of his too.
Yes, and there was some graphic novels, the Joe Sacco graphic novels from the ex-Yugoslavia. The Safe Area Garage Day, I think, was the one that I saw that you had as well.
I think that one was set in Bosnia, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah. I think I was just very impressed. Yeah, I'd moved to Kennington around about the same time that you opened the shop. So I was in this process of discovering the new area that I was living in.
Yes.
And then I found Lower Marsh and came across the shop and thought, what a wonderful place. And yes,
thank you.
Indeed it was. And like a lot of people, so I wanted to visit as often as I could.
Yeah, and you joined the book club, which you're still involved with, even though you're sort of commuting between Brussels and London. Well, not at the moment, you're not. But,
yes, I mean, it's a funny situation. So my job is now based in Brussels, and I'd been in London for several years until the end of 2019. I worked for the European Union, the European Commission, and I was based at the London office of the European Commission until the end of 2019.
Right.
And then my job moved back to Brussels in January last year.
Yes.
And I was still renting here in London whilst looking for a place to live in Brussels when the pandemic hit and they said, right, you've all got to work from home. And since I hadn't yet moved home from London back to Brussels, got back on the Eurostar, came back to London, thinking that it would be for a few weeks, and a year later here I still am, working from my home in London, but actually my job is based in Brussels, and when the pandemic eases a bit more, then I'll be going back to Brussels again.
Heading back, okay. Yeah. And your job or the role is about promoting European languages, is that correct?
That's the job I was doing when I was based in London.
Yes.
Now I'm back to working as a translator. So I worked for several years in Brussels before I came to London in 2014.
Yes.
As a translator. So my job was translating various administrative, legal, technical documents into English from different languages for the European Commission. So all connected to European Union policy making and legislation and so on.
Okay.
And I'm back to doing that. But when I moved to London in 2014, it was still with the European Commission, but I was in a role where my job was an outreach role, where it was helping to promote language learning, helping to promote the language industries, so translation and interpreting, and promoting various language-related initiatives that the European Commission does still in the EU countries, no longer in the UK, unfortunately.
Not at all. No.
Not now because it was all linked to the UK being a member of the
course,
EU.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So that role ended at the end of 2019.
Wow.
And so I moved then back to Brussels, and it was back into my old job of translating. So sitting in front of a computer all day with a piece of paper, a document propped up by the side of the screen, and trying to figure out how to say that and write that in English onto my computer. So that's the job now.
So was there a transition period between who would take on the role of looking after language and how language was going to be preserved in the UK between Wales, Ireland, Scotland and England, and where who's now going to be ensuring language or languages are retained?
Well, there are already lots of different national bodies in the UK that deal with language, promote language learning, deal with language-related issues. So the role I was doing was sort of additional from the EU. So it was using the resources of the EU civil service to provide a little bit more support. So we would organise events at our base, which is Europe House in Westminster, where we had a conference area. So we organised events on learning different languages or on conferences on translation of different kinds and so on. So what we were doing was always sort of additional. It wasn't replacing what the UK was already doing.
Right.
But yes, it means that additional element is no longer there.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, there are still plenty of bodies and institutions in the UK that are helping to promote language learning and the language industries.
Yes. And obviously you don't know every language under the sun, but I know you know quite a lot, and you seem to be learning more and more as the years went on. Certainly while I had travelling through.
Yeah, well, and one of them I started learning because of an event at Travelling Through.
Oh, that was the Japanese.
That's right. Yes, yeah.
Yes, and how long did it take you to learn the language well enough to then go to Japan? Because I know that was your ultimate goal, wasn't it?
Yes, well, with that one, I'd already been thinking that I wanted to start learning an Asian language. A couple of years previously, when I was still in Brussels, I'd done a year of evening classes in Korean, but for various reasons I wasn't able to devote as much time to it, and so I had to stop that. And I had this idea that one day I'd like to learn Chinese, and I had this idea that because Japanese uses the Chinese characters, that if you learn Japanese, it's sort of an easy way into learning the Chinese characters, and then if you then subsequently try to learn Chinese, it's easier than it would be. And a couple of people have told me that.
Yes.
But Japanese.
So it wasn't just your theory.
It wasn't a theory. But also, I think like a lot of people, I'd wanted to for years and years to visit Japan. I think it's one of those places that nobody would say they wouldn't be interested in visiting, but because it's on the other side of the world and because I sort of have interests in other countries and languages and so on, I'd never got round to it.
Yeah.
And then when I went to the event at Travelling Through with Leslie
Downer.
Leslie Downer,
yes.
That's it. And she gave this absolutely wonderful presentation about the tradition of pilgrimage and long-distance walking in Japan, and I'm really keen on hiking and walking and so on. And I was blown away by the things she was presenting. I thought, right, that's it. I've got to go to Japan, not just be something that you say, yeah, one day I'll go.
Yes.
And that tied in with already wanting to be learning an Asian language. So, and because I'd whenever I go to places, I like to be able to say a few things at least, or to be starting to get a handle on the language.
Yes, yes.
And so I decided to sign up for language classes at Morley College, which is
just down the road.
Just down the road from the shop and from where I live. So it all came together like that, really. And then I think it was within the first year or so that I went to Japan for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And I could make out a few things, but and I couldn't have conversations. But there was certainly, there's an element of familiarity, and whenever you hear a scrap of conversation, or you see something on a poster or in a book, or whatever it is, in the environment when you're there, you get that nice satisfaction. So, yes, I recognise that, and I've learnt that. Yeah. But it's a tough language. I mean, I haven't learnt it. I did 3 years of language classes after that event.
Yeah.
And then last year, when I went back to Brussels for what turned out to be just a few weeks, I stopped the classes, and I'm working through this app where you can learn the Chinese characters, and I'm doing that kind of more or less passively. So it's on a bit of a hiatus at the moment.
And has it helped from learning?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, yeah. You certainly within that time, I've got quite a good familiarity with it. I went last just over a year ago. That was my second trip.
Mm-hmm.
And I was starting to have very, very basic conversational interactions with people.
Yeah.
And actually, I was supposed to go again last year. I managed to get tickets for the Olympics.
Oh, no.
And I was going to take my nephew. So that was my birthday and Christmas present to him. I was going to take him to Tokyo to the Olympics, and we were going to have a holiday out there. And that was supposed to be last summer. So that had kept the momentum up for learning.
Of course, yes.
And then, of course, that was called off. So that's partly responsible for the dip in my motivation recently. But I'm still hoping we're going to be able to go this summer.
Yes,
It's
still a big question mark over it, isn't it?
Yes, Japan isn't allowing anybody in at the moment, and certainly not from countries like ours that have got very high infection rates. So I'll have to see what will happen, whether for the Olympics they'll allow some arrangement where if you can show that you've had a vaccine, they'll let you in. I'm not sure yet. So I'm assuming that we're not going to be able to go, and if it turns out that we can, then that'll be a nice surprise.
Yeah, yes. But coming back to languages, you spent quite a bit of time in Eastern Europe, in Slovakia and the Czech Republic.
That's right, yeah.
And also Poland, was it as well? Or?
Yeah.
So do you have a solid knowledge and understanding and speaking knowledge of all these languages?
Yeah, well, as a translator, so a written translator, we only have to read what we need to understand, and we rarely have to speak it for our job. So an interpreter is the one that the person who needs to speak other languages. So I always say that when people ask me how many languages do you speak, I always say, well, I know more than I speak. Because I can read several that I'm not so confident speaking, or I would need a bit more time and a little bit more immersion speaking. But at school I did French, and I was pretty good at it. It was my best subject, but I ended up studying science at A level and then at university. And then I was very lucky at university. I managed to blag my way onto a course that gave me a year abroad studying biology in France.
Okay.
When my A-level results hadn't justified me being on that course, but somebody dropped out, and I managed to get on in their place, even though I hadn't really earned it with the grades. So I went to France for a year when I was an undergraduate, and that really brought my level of French up.
Which part of France were you in?
I was in Grenoble, in the southeast, on the edge of the Alps.
Very nice, yes.
Yeah, it's a very interesting city, a very nice place. And then I came back and finished university, and then did various sort of bits of travel and temping jobs and working in a pub, and I worked in a toilet roll factory in my hometown for a while.
Did you have links to get extra rolls?
I didn't go short a year ago. Yeah, but eventually I thought, well, what do I want to do? I wanted to do some more travel, but I didn't want to just it to be aimless travel. I wanted to do something a bit more productive along the way.
Yes.
So I came down to London for a month. That was actually the first time really I got to know London, other than a couple of tourist trips.
When you say you came down, so that was from...
So I was living in Bolton, my hometown, back with my parents at that point.
Yes.
And I decided I was going to train to be an English teacher, to teach English abroad, TEFL, teaching English as a
Yes.
foreign language. So I came and did a month-long course at a school in Kensington. The school offered anybody that passed their course, they guaranteed you a job in one of their partner schools in what we used to call Eastern Europe, but I guess now Central and Eastern Europe.
Yes.
It was the early 90s, and so after the fall of the Berlin Wall, these countries were suddenly shifting their education systems to learning English rather than Russian.
Yes,
and so there was
yes.
this huge demand for English teachers. This place in Kensington had a lot of jobs going in their partner schools, and they had a particularly high number of jobs going in Slovakia. They had a partnership with a whole chain of schools across the whole country.
Yes.
And at that point I was dead set on learning Hungarian, actually,
Okay.
because I knew it was a non-Indo-European language, so not related to almost any other European language.
Yes.
And I thought it sounded exotic, and I thought it'd be quite cool to learn a language like that not many other people knew.
Yes.
And this school in Kensington did have some places at a partner school in Hungary. But on the TEFL course, this month-long course, I sort of fell for one of the fellow trainee teachers.
Yeah.
And she'd already been allocated to go to a school in Slovakia.
Right.
And so I thought, oh, well, maybe Slovakia would. And also I really love mountains and mountain walking and mountain climbing. And Slovakia is a mountainous country, I discovered. I didn't really know anything about it.
Is.
Whereas Hungary, I thought, was relatively flat. And I've since got to know Hungary's mountains a little bit.
Yes.
But anyway, I ended up teaching English in Bratislava in Slovakia.
Okay.
And when I got there, threw myself into learning the Slovak language, the local language there.
Yes.
And I just really loved it. And by the end of my year of teaching, I didn't want to leave. In 9 months, I'd made quite a lot of progress. I got fairly conversationally fluent, and I was really keen to properly master it and become really very, very fluent. But I realised I couldn't do that whilst I was teaching English, because everybody wanted to speak English
of
to
course,
me.
Yes.
But I was lucky then that I got a job working for the Slovak national radio broadcaster. They were setting up their foreign broadcasting service. Slovakia was only a few months old at that point.
Yes.
Czechoslovakia had split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So they were setting up this new foreign broadcasting service, their equivalent of the BBC World Service.
Mm-hmm.
And they had an English language department that had a half-hour a day broadcast on shortwave. And I got a job working in that department. So I became a radio broadcaster with absolutely no experience whatsoever.
Well done.
No idea what I was doing, but because I was the native English speaker and they needed somebody to correct their scripts. Most of the staff of that department were Slovak. So they needed people to correct their scripts, but also to be an English voice on the broadcast as well. So I had the Sunday broadcast. So I had to create half. Yeah, and it was fabulous. Well, each day had a theme.
Yeah.
And the Sunday program was the mixed bag. So every 2 weeks we had the readers' letters.
Yeah.
And the readers' letters were very interesting. This is well before the internet and before internet broadcasting, so people could only listen to us on shortwave.
Okay.
And we had people in China and South America. I mean, quite a lot of Americans of Slovak heritage who would be listening into the broadcast because they wanted to hear about what was happening in their ancestral country.
Yeah.
So I did that, and that was every couple of weeks. I did various different things. I was interested in folk music, so once I went to one of Slovakia's big folk music festivals, and I did a big piece from there, interviewed musicians and the organisers and the people who made these instruments.
Yeah, yeah. So it was a real opportunity for you to actually travel a bit around Slovakia.
It was perfect. I got to travel around the country as part of this job and learn more about the country.
Yes.
Whilst practicing the language as well, because on air I had to speak English.
Yes.
But everything else I had to do in Slovak, so going to the canteen, going to the record library and taking out records to play on the programme.
Yeah.
I had to do all of that in Slovak, picking up my wages, everything in Slovak. So that really got my level going.
Yeah, yes.
And through the contacts there also, I started to get offered other work. So I got offered some voiceover work. A lot of them were Slovak companies that had products that they wanted suddenly to sell to the West.
Okay.
So they were creating little promotional videos and they needed somebody to narrate these videos. And then eventually I started being the one that would translate the scripts of these things from Slovak into English. So that's when I first started to do translation.
Okay. How many years were you in Slovakia then?
I was there 3.5 years, or just under 3.5 years, but in my in my consciousness, it feels like a much longer time.
Yeah.
It was a seminal period in my life, really. I sort of did a lot of growing up. I was still very green, really, when I went there.
Yeah.
Naive about a lot of things, and about myself. And there was a lot of self-understanding I went through, and quite a thrilling time in the life of this new country as well. So, yeah, only 3.5 years, but it feels like more. And I came out of it with this knowledge of the Slovak language, which ultimately, many years later, because I went into journalism and didn't use my languages very much for 10 years. But many years later, it meant that I then had the material that I could apply for work as a translator with the European Union with.
Yes, and that sense of being there for much longer probably had a lot to do with the fact you're immersing yourself in a completely different culture, a different way of being and thinking, as well as the language and music and everything. So almost like being reborn, as it were.
Yeah.
In a good way, I imagine.
Yeah, it was, absolutely. It felt like that. It was like discovering a whole new side of world culture. I mean, now with the cheap flight revolution, and Slovakia is a member of the EU, and of course it's a European country, and it doesn't feel so foreign now. But back then, at least to me, who had only been to, I think I'd only been to France and maybe Germany at that point.
Okay.
And we spent most of our holidays when I was a child in this country.
Yes.
So I hadn't done an awful lot of foreign travel, and then to go to this place that had been behind the Iron Curtain, shrouded in mystery to most people, and now had opened up, and it felt very, very different. And there were some elements of that which were really appealing.
Yes.
The people were lovely, really sort of intelligent, interesting, engaged, witty, funny. A sense of humour is a really earthy sense of humour with sort of this wry wit, which feels very close to our British sense of humour. So I just fell in love with the whole place, the people, the countryside. It's beautiful green mountainous country.
Yeah. Yes.
So I found it too appealing to leave after a year.
So I was doing a little bit of research about you, Paul, and I noticed, and I had no idea, that you had published a number of books, one of which was cycling the border between the Czech Republic and Slovakia.
Yeah.
What inspired that journey?
Yeah, that was all self-published, I should say.
Self-published, that's a good thing.
So self-published,
Yes.
There's the photo books.
Yes.
They're like photo essays, photo reportage.
Yes.
With lots of photographs and text alongside them. Yeah, well, that was I think that was the third one of the three that I've done. The first one I did was riding down the River Danube.
Okay.
Bratislava is on the River Danube, and when I lived there, I lived on a housing estate on the other side of the river from the main centre, and I used to cross the river every day. And we used to do bicycle rides up and down the river, either towards Austria and Vienna, one direction, or towards Hungary in the other direction from Bratislava. And I said to myself, one day I'd love to cycle down the entire river from where it rises in the hills in the Black Forest right onto the delta on the Black Sea.
In fact, there were two Cicerone guides of riding Cycleway of the Danube.
Yes.
That always inspired me. If I'd known that you'd done that, I would have picked your brains before now. But anyway.
when I did it was 2004, and it was only the first volume was available at that point.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah, and I used that as far as Budapest, I think it went.
Yes.
And then I had to kind of make it up for the rest of it, but I just got the best maps I could along the route. And my rule was wherever I could, I'd take the road that went closest to the river.
Yes. So how much of that journey was actually by the river?
Most of it, yeah. There was very rarely any sections where you had to go very far from the river.
Okay.
All the way down. So I did that, and I kind of put together a photo book from that with some of my impressions.
Yes.
But that was more for myself, really. But then, whilst living in Slovakia, in Bratislava in particular, Bratislava's right on the western border of Slovakia, on the border with Austria. Mm-hmm. And so when I moved there, and I was living on this housing estate, which was literally the edge of the estate, a few more yards, and it was the Austrian border.
Yes.
And by then, of course, we could travel into Austria. But seeing the difference, the material difference in the state of the country on one side and the other side, I got very interested in this divide between East and West, communist and capitalist and so on. And when it was coming up to the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, I wanted somehow to do some kind of project journalistically, at that point I was working as a journalist, as a
Okay.
policy journalist in environment policy.
In this country then?
I was in Brussels by
You were in
then.
Brussels,
Yeah,
okay.
so that's how I ended up in Brussels, working as a journalist on environment policy. And I wanted to do something journalistic, and I was very keen on photography and very keen on bicycle riding and long distance bicycle riding. So I decided to combine them
Yes.
by doing this ride along the Iron Curtain. I did it from north to south, and I went from near Lübeck on the border between the old East and West Germany
Yes.
down to Trieste on the border between the old Yugoslavia,
Oh, yeah.
and
Beautiful
Slovenia
place, yes.
and Italy.
Yeah.
And then from there I got a train to Berlin, and I cycled around the route of the old Berlin Wall.
Yes.
I did a book about that, and I spoke to people on the way, and I interviewed as many people as I could with the languages I had at the time.
Which one? What were your languages at the time?
Well, I wasn't with German. I've never been that good at German, but I was able to sort of put together some questions in advance, and I
Okay.
got an English friend who speaks really good German, and she gave me some German speaking practice.
Yeah.
So with the German, I had just enough to put questions to people
Yeah.
and to listen to the answers, and I could understand enough of the answers to know what the next question was.
Okay.
And I was recording all this at the time.
Oh,
So in terms of
brilliant.
understanding everything,
Yes.
in terms of then using the quotes for the purposes of the book, then I would go off the recording.
Yes.
So I had just enough German, and then the route comes into Czech Republic,
Yes.
and Czech is very similar to Slovak. I've never lived in the Czech Republic, but if you learn Slovak, it's almost like learning Czech as well. It doesn't take you
Yes.
much to understand that. So I could speak to Czechs,
Mhm.
and then the route goes along that stretch near Bratislava, where I used to live.
Yes.
So I was okay there, and then the route hits Hungary.
Okay.
And there's a long section where the old Iron Curtain was between Hungary and Austria, and I didn't know any Hungarian at all at that point, so that was a bit of a black hole. I have since then I've learned Hungarian for
Have
work.
you really? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, well, the
It was
place
always
where
on the cards, wasn't it?
yeah, well, I'd always
Just took
wanted to,
longer.
yeah. So I ended up coming back to it. So I could now I could speak to people, but then I couldn't really,
Mhm.
and because it was going through very rural areas, actually. This idea that wherever you go in Europe everybody speaks English is really not the case
No.
even now.
No, it is
And in that rural, isolated area of Western Hungary along the border with Austria, I found very few people that I could communicate with. So that was a bit of a black hole in my in my journalistic endeavour, because I
Yeah.
couldn't really get any impressions from there. And then there's the border with Slovenia. Slovenia was a bit better. More people spoke English, and I could understand a bit of Slovenian because it's a Slavic language,
Yeah.
not too far away from Slovak. And then the final stretch is along the border with Italy, and I don't speak Italian at all, so that was also a place I couldn't really communicate with people.
Mhm.
So
But with French, you can kind of get a understanding, but you can't
I can sort of
necessarily speak it.
yes, I certainly can't speak it. I can understand some written Italian,
Yes.
but yeah, I just didn't have enough of a level with Italian.
Yes.
And actually, there's not so much of a stretch of that journey which involves Italy.
Okay.
That it felt worth trying to put some effort into learning it.
So this photographic kind of cycling memoir, almost
Yeah,
travel memoir, is called
I call it Fragments,
Fragments. Okay.
and the idea was to document in the photographs what remains physically
Yes.
of that time of division. So rusting fences, disused watchtowers,
Yeah.
things like that. And there's quite a lot, particularly on the old border between Germany, West and East Germany.
Yes,
But all
yeah.
along there is lots of things.
Did you find
But-
when you spoke to people and about that people were open at that time to talk? I suppose it was 20 years on, so probably more so than if it had been 2 years on, or
Yeah, it was 20 years on, and they were actually, and that was the second part of what I wanted to do, was to document what remained in people's heads at that
yes,
time.
yes,
And there was quite a lot.
yeah, yeah,
People still had a bit of distrust of those on the other side. On either side of this inner German border, as they called it, there was still a lack of communication sometimes.
even 20 years on.
Even 20 years
Wow,
on, yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Mind you, you come to London and sometimes people don't speak to the next
No,
door
that's,
neighbours. So
that's very
it's
true.
not
No, it
until
is.
the pandemic. I suddenly got to know all my neighbours in the last year. It's
Yes,
that's
'cause
been one of the
where-
great things
Where
about it.
you live, you had wasn't your street or your square on TV or something for doing a gym workout?
Yeah,
Isn't it?
one of the neighbours on the square is a really keen keep fit guy, and he's quite a he's a big character, big personality, and he started, I think, even in the first week of lockdown, he wanted to keep our spirits up, so he said he's going to do a doorstep exercise session, so we all stand on our doorstep, so we're physically distanced.
Yeah.
And he would lead us through this routine, which we ended up doing it twice a week.
Did you really? Did you get fit from it?
And I think as well as keeping us physically fit, it also meant that we were all coming out and seeing our neighbours, and it was a good laugh. Yeah. And it led to other things, and eventually we did a charity version of it where we raised over £10,000 for some local charities, including the Vauxhall City Farm. So community effort then, all right. As well as getting you all fit and also mentally. Absolutely. I don't know what kind of state I would be in over the last year if we hadn't had that thing that's been binding the neighbourhood together and the community together, and meaning that we've all got to know each other. Now I go out to the front door to do my weekly shop or whatever it is, or to go for a walk or a run, and almost every time I go out there's somebody that you're saying hello to because you now know them when you didn't before.
Yes.
And it's wonderful.
I'm sure that's happened in quite a few areas around London.
Must have done, yeah. And it's how things should be really all the time.
Definitely, and how it used to be, I think.
Yes,
for a long time. I mean, when I first moved into my area in South London, the gardens, all the fences were actually at waist height, so like a metre high. So everybody talked to everybody. But over the years, as the older generation moved out or passed on or whatever, and the younger generation came in, the fences got higher and higher, and now they're like 2 meters, and now you can't see your neighbours. And it's extraordinary, isn't it, how this idea of wanting community and yet also wanting complete so-called privacy, which is actually ridiculous because half the street are flats, so you can see into people's gardens anyway from your flat window. But it's that idea of not wanting to talk to people. It's very sad in some ways. And then, I mean, especially I noticed it more having been away abroad in the Balkans, where everybody talks to everybody. Even on the aeroplane going to Kosovo, it's like being in a cafe, but it's a cafe in the air. Everybody was up chatting to everybody else. Nobody sat down at all. Yeah. It was lovely.
A lot of cultures and countries do find it a lot easier to just talk to strangers than I think we do in this country.
Yeah.
And it's so important.
Yeah.
Actually, I just read a book by Malcolm Gladwell called Talking to Strangers. I think it's his latest book.
Yes.
It goes into those sorts of things about how we misjudge strangers. But yeah, I think it's one of the best things we can do is talk to strangers. But
definitely.
Something about the way the world is working and something about the way that social media is working, it means that we do that less and less because people seem to be more and more comfortable with interaction through a screen. And they interact with strangers, but it's with a stranger's Twitter account on Twitter or on Instagram or whatever. But actually just face-to-face talking to a stranger, striking up a conversation, it can be a very rewarding experience. I think it's always a good idea to do that.
Yes. I mean, sometimes it's even difficult to catch somebody's eye to even say hello or good morning to, because they're so just either got the head down or they're looking at a screen or they've got headphones on. Actually, that was one thing in the shop that, generally speaking, we would always make a point of saying hello, good morning, or is there anything we could help you with? So it meant that people took out their earphones and then would quite often happily strike up a conversation. But you just had to create that invitation to them that yes, let's talk. And most people were very happy to. You'd have the odd one who didn't want to, but they were almost surprised that you wanted to talk to them and ask them, were they all right? Yeah. And it is hard sometimes to break through that barrier, particularly if you're just walking down the street. But
it's fear of initiating, isn't it? That means most people tend not to. It's interesting you say about the shop. It's something I notice when I go to Poland. So as part of my job as a translator now, I've been lucky to learn Polish with the courses that we get from my employer, and I spent quite a bit of time in Poland. Never lived there, but going there for language immersion classes, but also I go there for holidays because I just like being there. Yes. And when you go into a shop in Poland, everybody says hello in the shop, any kind of shop, if it's a supermarket or something. everybody will say hello when you come in, and they will say goodbye when you go out.
Yes, yes.
It's strange when that doesn't happen. I think that's great. I
It
think
is.
it's great
No,
that they've retained that.
It's acknowledging the human being that's just walked
Yes.
into your shop,
Yes.
and thanking them for coming in and thanking them for looking around, and perhaps they haven't bought anything, but they'll remember you if you say thank you and have a good day or whatever. And also you're no longer invisible, and I think it's important not to be invisible. I don't know, maybe I'm old-fashioned.
I think you and me both, but I think there's a place for old-fashionedness.
Yeah. So we come back from
I went off a complete tangent, and I didn't tell you about the Czech and Slovak border book. That was
So-
more of a chronological thing. The Fragments book, which was about the old east-west border, the Iron Curtain
yes,
border.
yeah.
That's sort of the longest one, and the one that I've put most into, and the one I'm proudest of, I guess. Had a good reception. I mean, not huge sales. It was only self-published, and for various reasons I couldn't promote it as much as I would have done otherwise. But
Yeah.
then a couple of years later, it was coming up to the 20th anniversary of the split of Czechoslovakia
Yes.
into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and so I wanted to do something similar to mark that point and that anniversary, because I felt even closer to that old Czechoslovakia, having lived in the Slovak bit of it, and by then knowing the Czech language pretty well. So my initial plan was to walk or hike the border between the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So the interesting thing about there,
How long is that border?
300 or 400 kilometres, 200 or
Okay.
300 kilometres.
So quite a way.
It's quite, yeah, I mean, it's not huge, it's quite a distance.
Yes.
But the interesting thing is where the Iron Curtain bike ride, what I was doing there was going along a border which no longer existed. I mean, they were made up of national borders which still existed, but in terms of the division between East and West Europe and the Iron Curtain, that was a border that had been there and wasn't there, and I was looking for traces of it.
Right.
Whereas the border between the Czech Republic and Slovakia was a new border which hadn't been there for all the time that Czechoslovakia existed,
Yeah.
and so this was now a new border. So it was
Okay.
the opposite case.
Oh wow.
Although,
Yeah.
in fact, because of the history of those countries, that border between the Czech Republic and Slovakia actually had a much older history.
Mhm.
And at one point, because what is now Slovakia used to be part of Hungary, and what is now the Czech Republic used to be part of Austria, and they came together
Yeah.
in Austro-Hungary.
Okay.
But
and
before that, they weren't part of each other. So even though Czech Republic and Slovakia speak very similar languages, and they've got in some ways quite similar traditions and so on, actually for most of their history until the early 20th century,
yeah.
they didn't have a history of being in the same state.
Okay.
Actually,
so-
it was only Czechoslovakia, which existed from 1918 to 1993, that they were together.
Yeah.
So that was the idea of that. My plan was to hike, but the thing is that border really does go along through these very remote hills,
Okay.
and there's virtually nowhere right on the borderline which I wanted to follow. There's very little in the way of facilities, so it was either going to be take a tent, camp every
Camping all
night,
the
take
way,
all your food with you, and do the hike that way. And I considered it, but one, I didn't have the time that I would need to take off
Yeah.
to do it. I wasn't too keen on carrying this huge rucksack with all my stuff, just with the objective of following the very line of the border.
Yes.
But also, because it's very remote, I thought I probably won't come across that many people. And the idea was to also talk to people
Of course.
on
yeah,
both
to
sides
get
of the
their
border, and
impressions.
20 years on, Czechoslovakia is no more. What are your feelings about it?
Yeah.
People on the Czech side, people on the Slovak side. So I did it as a bike ride again, and there were bits where I was able to sort of cycle on the rough ground that was following the very borderline on the ridge of the hills.
Yes.
But most of the time I was actually kind of going down into the valley either side of this line of hills, on the Czech side, on the Slovak side, and I managed to sort of meet lots of people on either side,
Yes.
as well as tracing a line roughly along the border. And
Okay.
yeah, asking them, how do you feel about it? And the overwhelming feeling was people said, oh, I don't feel Czech, or I don't feel Slovak, I feel Czechoslovak. So a lot of
Yeah.
people, because a lot of the people I spoke to had lived in that border area most of their lives.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? The border area people are probably those who actually embrace both
Yeah.
cultures, as it were, or probably
Yes.
have intermarried, as it were. So they wouldn't have that defined feeling of being one or the other, I imagine.
Yes, yeah.
Um,
And because they were geographically closer to the other country, because it was just on the other side of the border,
Yes.
so closer to the other country than to their national capital, say,
Yeah.
They felt more an affinity with the other side than
Okay.
maybe even some people in their own country.
Yeah. Yes.
So a lot of, I mean, there were a handful of people that I met that said, "Oh no, it's it's a great thing. I'm not keen on the Slovaks," or some Slovaks said, "I'm not keen on the Czechs." But most people said, "Oh, I still feel Czechoslovak. I still feel like we're one country."
Yes. You knew that Gita, who made our cakes at Travelling Through, she was Slovak.
Yeah, I'm not sure I ever met her.
Did you
I
not?
definitely ate her
You
cakes. I'm not sure I met her.
Yeah, beautiful.
And they were
cakes.
lovely. Yeah. Yeah. So that was the last book I did.
Yes.
A couple of years ago, well, a few years ago now, I cycled down the river Vistula in Poland. So it's sort of it's the longest river in Poland, and the river is entirely located within Poland, and it's like the backbone of the country, and it flows through Krakow and Warsaw and goes into the sea at Gdansk. So it's a real culturally and geographically central part of the country.
Yeah.
And I had a couple of week holiday cycling down that, and that was a fabulous thing. And I took lots of photographs, and I spoke to people, and my plan was to do some kind of book about that. But then I lost a memory card on which a big chunk of the photographs were on, and that took the wind out
Of course. Yes.
my sails entirely. I did a few years later. I then did find the memory card. It was actually when I was moving from Brussels to come to London.
Yes.
And I was having to clear up my stuff and move out, and I came across this memory card.
Oh my
It was
goodness.
like the back of a bookcase or
Thank
something.
goodness for that you've
So I've got
so
it,
you
but
It's
yeah,
just-
I haven't
you've
since
lost the
then.
momentum
I
at the
lost the
moment.
momentum. I will do it one day.
So these books, that if the podcast listeners are interested to have a look, they're on Blurb, isn't it? The website, and we'll put the links in the show notes so that people can look the books up.
That would be
And,
great. Thanks. Yeah, it's
And buy them if they wish.
it's a self-publishing photo book system, and yeah, so I've published them through that.
Are there any insights into what's inside the books anywhere? Have you got?
I think you can do a preview
Okay.
on the website.
All right,
Yeah, so
that's
you can
it.
look through and. Yeah,
Brilliant.
you can decide whether it's a load of rubbish and you're not going to waste your money. But,
Okay. Well, hopefully that won't be the case.
I think there's also an ebook version as well, which is much cheaper because it's print on demand,
Yes.
and
yeah.
because it's a photo book. They're not cheap.
No.
I mean,
yeah.
I don't see any of the money, or
Very little,
very
yeah.
little of it. It's really
A minute percentage.
really minute
yes.
margin.
Yes, that's the thing with photographic books, isn't it?
In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I got. You have to reach a threshold where you've accumulated enough that you get an email from Blurb that says we have a payment to give you. I think it was about £20, and I think that's the first email I had for about 4 years from them or something. So,
Oh, congratulations!
yeah, and I'd kind of almost forgotten about them. Really. So,
Well, maybe there'll be a spike after this podcast. You never know.
yeah,
So,
they come out pretty good quality actually.
Yeah.
They're nicely produced.
Yes.
They tend to be on the dear side,
but it's documenting another moment in time. So that was, what year was that? So that's they 20 years on. So
that last one, the Czech-Slovak one, I called that the Velvet
2009.
Border.
Yeah.
So after the Velvet Revolution, which is what they called in 1989 when the Czechoslovakia sort of overthrew the communists. That was the 20th anniversary of that was the 20th anniversary of the
2009.
it was the 20th anniversary of the split of Czechoslovakia, which happened on the 1st of January 1993.
93. Okay.
So that was 2013 then. 8 years ago now.
Yes.
That one, and the other one, Fragments, which was the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Which was
that was
89.
That was
wasn't it?
89. So
Yeah.
I did the bike ride for that in October, November 2008,
Yes.
and then that gave me enough time to process all the photographs and all the material I'd got into a book, which came out then in the following year, 2009,
Okay.
for the 20th anniversary.
Coming back to your time in Brussels, the difference between translation and interpretation,
Yes.
and why you go down one route and not the other.
Yes.
Yeah. What makes you is obviously between whether you read or you speak, but why go down that route rather than the other route?
That's
Or
a
could
good
you do
question.
both?
Some people like doing both. I've done a bit of interpreting. In fact, my best ever job, my favourite ever job, was an interpreting job. I had just come back from living in Slovakia. So at the end of that 3.5 years there, I came back to the UK, back to live in Bolton again. I set myself up as a freelance translator and interpreter, if needed, of Slovak and Czech. And I wanted to earn the money to do a master's degree then. That was the idea of it. I hadn't thought about it, translation and interpreting then as a career. It was just a means of earning some money to do a master's.
Yes.
And I got various translation jobs, so the written translation through agencies. And then I saw in the Champions League, I'm a football fan, I saw that Manchester United, a nearby team, not my team, I support Bolton Wanderers,
Okay.
but Manchester United were drawn to play a team from Slovakia in the Champions League. And so I rang Manchester United up, and you could do that in those days. This was 1997. And I just said, I see you're playing a team from Slovakia in the Champions League. I'm a translator and interpreter of Slovak. Is there any work, anything you need doing? And they called me in.
Yeah.
The club secretary called me in, and I had a chat with him. And he said, yeah, okay, we'll take you on, we'll get you. So
Brilliant.
So I did 3 days of interpreting during this Champions League fixture with Manchester United.
Yes.
So the day or two before the match, I had to interpret at a pre-match dinner
Yes.
with the board of directors of the two clubs.
Okay.
And so that included having to interpret
Oh,
for Bobby
interesting.
Charlton, who was the director of Manchester
Yes.
United. During the match, I had to be in the announcer's booth because they have to have somebody that can speak the language of the visiting fans
Yeah.
in case of an emergency.
Yes.
So I was in the announcer's booth during the match.
Okay.
And before the match was just about to start, the announcer, she said, can you just write out in Slovak, how would you say, welcome to Old Trafford, you know, etc., etc. So I wrote it in Slovak and I sort of showed it to her, and she said, no. And she handed me the microphone and said, no, go on. You've got to say it.
Oh my
And
goodness.
so I took this microphone and said in Slovak, you know, welcome to the fans from Slovakia, welcome to Old Trafford, Manchester, welcome to Old Trafford. We hope we're going to have a fantastic match this evening. Hope you enjoy it and stay safe. And when you go home, have good happy travels back. And hear my voice booming out around Old Trafford was quite an experience.
Yes.
But then because I think this team from Slovakia, I think it was their first time in the Champions League, and they hadn't been yet to anywhere like Old Trafford.
Yes.
So it was quite an occasion, and I don't think
Yes.
they'd heard maybe somebody welcoming them in their language in
Yeah.
this foreign country from their point of view, and so they just started clapping, and so there was like there's this sort of peal of applause came back up off the terraces and wafted into our announcer's booth. It was quite an experience.
Yes. Yeah. Well done, Paul.
And then after the match, I had to do the post-match press conference with Alex Ferguson. The Slovak team had brought their own interpreter,
Yes.
and it was his job, in theory, to be doing any interpreting from English into Slovak, because there were a handful of Slovak journalists there.
Yes.
So in the post-match press conference, he was supposed to be interpreting Alex Ferguson into Slovak for the visiting Slovaks.
Right.
And I was supposed to interpret the visiting Slovak manager from his Slovak into English for any British journalists. But in the post-match press conference, the journalists were not interested in the Slovak manager. They were only interested in Alex Ferguson. And the interpreter that had come with the Slovak team, Vladimir, I'd got to know him a bit over the couple of days. 3 minutes before we were due to go into this press conference, he came up to me and he said, Paul, will you do me a favour? Would you mind interpreting both ways in doing the whole press conference? So that means interpreting out of English into Slovak, meaning me speaking Slovak, which I'm fairly comfortable with, but it's not usually the way that interpreters go. Usually you interpret, and translators, into your own native language that you know best. Yeah. So I said, I can do, and I knew that would mean having to interpret for Alex Ferguson. And I said, but why? Is there something wrong? He said, it's Alex Ferguson. I can't understand a word he says. And I felt for him. He had trouble understanding what Alex Ferguson was saying to interpret it into Slovak, whereas of course I could understand Alex Ferguson perfectly well.
Yes, and you forget that, not necessarily just understanding English, it's understanding the different intonations how people speak English.
Yes.
It can be very, very difficult for a non-native English speaker to get to grips with.
Yeah.
Yes.
You've got to know both languages, quite well, and sometimes it's not so easy to understand what people are saying.
Yes, yeah.
So that's kind of more or less the only interpreting I've done. I mean, if there were Slovak sports teams coming to play in the UK every day of the week, I might have been able to make a career out of that. But I realised that wasn't going to be a go. But that was consecutive interpreting, where you are listening to somebody speak, you take notes, you try and remember what they're saying.
Yeah.
They stop.
Yes.
And then the interpreter speaks. So that's called consecutive interpreting.
Yes.
I mean, in that case, actually, Alex Ferguson didn't want to stop because Man United won 3-0. He was in a good mood. He just wanted to talk.
Of course.
He was speaking to the UK journalists. The idea that he had to stop for an interpreter who would interpret his words into Slovak for a very small number of Slovak journalists that he wasn't interested in. So I actually had to interrupt him, and they'd warned me in advance. They'd said, the people at Man United, they'd said, you will have to just interrupt him. He won't stop for you. Yeah. You have to interrupt him so that you can interpret. So eventually I did. He didn't seem to appreciate that. He kind of gave me a dark look when I interrupted him. But that's consecutive interpreting.
Yes.
Then you've got, in the EU system, my colleagues who work as interpreters, they're doing simultaneous or conference interpreting, where the interpreter is in a soundproofed booth. The speakers are on microphones in a chamber, say in the European Parliament.
Yes.
And the interpreter is listening through headphones and is speaking into a microphone, and those people that want to listen to their interpretation have headphones on, and they can choose the channel.
Tune in.
They choose tune into the different language.
Yes.
So in the EU we have 24 official languages. The 27 member states, of course, all use different languages. And the ones that they nominate that they want to use as an official language in the context of the EU, there end up being 24 of those, because some countries share a language, like French and German and so on.
Yes.
So there are 24 so-called official languages. So if you go and listen to a debate in the European Parliament, and there's a public area, visitors area, the different members of the European Parliament will speak different languages. I mean, some of them, even if they're not English speakers, they might choose to speak in English. But generally, when I used to go and follow the debates there, they would speak in their own language. And if you couldn't understand that language, you had to put the headphones on, listen to the interpreter.
When I was there,
And and you turn the dial, and you've got the choice of 24 languages to listen into.
Yes, it's a big machine. But actually, you just reminded me, because in Kosovo, for the meetings that I was involved in between Kosovo Albanians and then the Serbs from Belgrade, so we were speaking, the language was English, Albanian and Serbian, but we had no booths. It was just literally everybody talking over the table all at the same time. And the first time I heard this, when I was speaking English, I was thinking, this is so rude, everybody's talking over the top of me. Completely unaware, because I'd never been in that environment before, that actually they had to, because it was the only way that they could keep up with me and understand, and to be able to interpret enough to the people either side of them. But it was actually very distracting, trying to keep your train of thought, and you're half listening into these two other languages both being spoken at the same time. So it's and
it's an amazing skill.
It is. It's an incredible skill.
Simultaneous interpreting.
To be able to almost. I mean, at times when I was speaking, they would go, Emma, you've got to stop, wait a minute, because you don't fully appreciate how, I didn't at the beginning anyway, how difficult it is to encapsulate everything that you're trying to say, and then translate it in your brain, and then get it out in your language, getting the right meaning across as well. And then also, they want to then ask a question. So it meant meetings were incredibly slow as a result, because then they would want to ask a question, and they would ask it, they'd have to tell the translator would then have to translate it to me in English, and backwards and forwards it would go. It made me fully appreciate how the role of both translators and interpreters, and how valuable they are, and how little they're acknowledged. Perhaps more so now.
The best ones are invisible, a bit like translators, a bit like football referees.
Yes.
If you don't notice them, that means they're doing a good job. Yeah, it's a phenomenal skill, and that's essentially why I don't think I went into it, because I don't think I'm good enough to do it at the level that you need to do it at simultaneous level.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm much happier being a written translator, a translator where if you don't know a word on the page, you can sit back, open a dictionary,
yes, and take
ask
your
the
time.
person in the next door office, have a think about
Google it.
Google, yeah, and then you find it, and then then you can perfect the turn of phrase, and you can polish it, and you got perfect word.
Yes.
Whereas interpreters, whatever's coming in, they have to put something out, even if they don't understand everything. And there must be occasions where they don't understand words. But I think you have to know a language better to be an interpreter, because you have to be able to deal with idioms and colloquialisms and jokes and cultural references to be able to make sense of them in the language. And as a translator, you come across those and you might be able to research them. An interpreter, you can't generally.
No.
So I think you need to know the language better than a translator needs to know it.
Yes.
And you need to be fluent and articulate in your own language, the language you're interpreting into.
Definitely. Now with London becoming more and more multicultural, and noticing, particularly in the bookshop, I mean, my aim was to try and get books written by authors from all around the world, but in fact that was quite difficult and challenging at times to achieve, because they hadn't been translated into English, or some had, but the translation was known to be not a good one. But I know that is changing, and the demand for translated books is probably at an all-time high, I would say. Not talking from any facts and figures here, but just from what I experienced. And I mean, certainly for our book club, we had the Polish book.
Yes, Plough Over the Bones of the Dead.
That's right, Plough Over the Bones of the Dead.
Yeah, by Olga Tokarczuk, the Polish writer who won the Nobel Prize for Literature recently.
Yes, and we were lucky enough through you to have the translator.
Yes, Antonia Lloyd-Jones.
Yes, to be with us, and it was very insightful to hear her take on being a translator as well, and the importance of being able to pick up, as you were saying, the nuances of writers, of what they're trying to get across in a way that we can understand, or certainly in this country, with our humour, that it comes across with a kind of British or English humour, or whatever you want to call it, rather than a Polish humour. But at the same time, that translators don't lose the core message or essence or flavour of the author's style of writing, because it could make or break both the author and I suppose the translator too.
Yes.
I just wonder what your thoughts were on this.
It's a huge area.
Sorry, it's a big question, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it is. It's interesting. Yeah, and there's lots of things to pick up there. Well, first of all, translation and how you do translation. There's a vast academic field now of translation studies, studying how best to translate different types of document. But I mean, mainly concerned with translating literature.
Yes.
But going back to that point about how much translated literature there's this figure that was cited a lot of the time of 3% of books that were bought in English-speaking countries, so the UK and the United States mainly, were in translation. Whereas if you go to Italy and Spain, the proportion of books that people buy there, a much higher proportion of books there, are translations from other languages.
Yes.
Whereas in English reading countries and cultures, we're much less likely to read translations of books from other places. But that figure has started to go up a bit, as far as I understand it. The latest figures I've seen is sort of nearly 5%, which is still low, but I think there is starting to be more generally this greater adventurousness in wanting to read literature from other parts of the world, not seeing a translation of something from another country as being sort of second best to reading something originally written in English.
Yes.
And appreciating that the translator is a talented creative author in their own right.
Yeah.
And that they're capturing the experience of the original in a form that you can understand and read.
And appreciate.
Yes.
Hopefully, yes.
Yes, that's the idea. I must say, years ago, I always had this idea of, I don't really want to read a translation. I'd much rather read it in the original language. It always felt like kind of second best to being able to read something in the original language. But when you can't read the language and you don't have the resources to spend 20 years learning Japanese or whatever it is, but there is something there that's worth having access to in that other language, then it comes through a translator. So actually, my perception of translations now has gone completely the opposite direction. And as well as the Travelling Through Book Club I'm in, one other book club we met last night, actually, where we read only translated literature.
Okay.
And we've read some fantastic books. The book that we read last night is from Moldova, a place I've never been to and don't know much about. But it's a really funny book and a really good translation. Originally written in Russian, in Russian, by a Russian-speaking author in Moldova. Moldova's kind of half Russian-speaking, half Romanian-speaking. Yeah. But then within the field of translation, there are these tendencies. Some people, they talk about domesticating and foreignizing translations. So when you come across some element of the original, which is very specific to that place, do you, in your translation, do you try to change that for the equivalent in the country or the culture that you're translating into? So if somebody speaks with a really strong, I don't know, Krakow accent, or uses a lot of Krakow slang, in your translation, do you say, right, what am I going to pick for Krakow? Let's say Edinburgh, and so you get that person speaking with an Edinburgh accent or Edinburgh slang and so on, or do you just try and keep it as Krakowian slang so that people can see when they're reading it, this is there's something slightly foreign about it. There's schools of thought on which approach you take. I think if you open the book, if it's a good read, if it gets across to the reader what the experience that the author was intending for language he wrote or she wrote it in, you've probably done a good enough job. But it was really interesting when Antonia joined the book club. It was,
definitely. She translated one part and then someone else translated another part. Was that another book where there was two of them who were...
I'm not sure. I think it might have been... What it was in that book, Drive Your Plough Over the Bones of the Dead, the title is actually a quote from a poem or something written by Blake. William Blake.
Yes.
And within the book, one of the characters in the book is a translator who translates Blake into Polish.
That's right.
And so she had to deal with how do you translate that process of translating, writing about translating Blake into Polish. But do you
translate it back from the translator's translation or the original?
So she had to do a bit of juggling there, but it was very, very successful. I met her because, partly in the outreach job I was doing for the EU, my job was getting to know people and helping organise some events in the field of translation, including literary translation, so I came across it that way.
Yes.
But having never done literary translation myself, only this governmental, administrative, legal translation, when I came into that job and started meeting literary translators, inevitably you say to yourself, I wonder if I could have a go at that.
Yeah.
There are some courses, so there's a couple of summer schools, week-long summer schools in the UK. There's two main ones. One is based in Norwich, and the other one used to be based in London. The last couple of years it's moved to different institutions. This year it's going to be at Bristol University, although it's online.
Yes.
Where professional, top-level literary translators do a week of tuition for anybody that wants to come and study with them. I spent a week with Antonia and some other translators translating from Polish.
Okay.
And I chose Polish to be the language I wanted to give literary translation a try on for various reasons. So that's how I met Antonia, really, and got to know her, and sort of since became friends. I mean, she probably knows Poland better than almost any other British person there is, because she spent decades reading the literature of the country, but getting to know the culture, getting to know its authors, spending a lot of time there.
Yes.
And she knows the country, the culture, the language inside out. She's one of the best translators of Polish, certainly in this country, if not the world, into English.
It would be a hard act to follow then.
I wouldn't even try. But and she's prolific, absolutely prolific. She's done lots and lots.
Has she? Yes.
Yeah.
Perhaps I should get her on the podcast. But I did also note that you'd won a prize for translating. Was it Polish poetry?
Yes, it was it sounds very grand. It was called a translation challenge.
Okay.
So it's there's some literary organisations in Wales, and they organise a translation challenge every year of poetry, and they choose a different language each year.
Okay.
And they invite translators to take these poems in whichever language and translate them, and you submit your translation anonymously.
Yes.
And then they get a judge who's a an established translator that picks out the best translation. So a couple of years ago, the language that they chose for this challenge happened to be Polish.
Yes.
And the challenge was to translate 3 poems by a Polish author who actually lives in the UK. At that time, she lived on the Isle of Wight, and her poems were all about the Isle of Wight in this challenge. She now lives in Hastings.
Who is she?
She's called Violeta Krzegorzewska, Violeta Greg for short.
Okay.
Yeah, and Antonia was actually the judge.
Okay.
But because all the submissions are done anonymously, she didn't, and I didn't tell her that I had entered it.
Yeah.
She didn't know whose work she was judging. Yeah, and she picked mine out as the winner.
Yeah.
To my surprise, and perhaps to hers as well when she found out it was me that had done it. So that was a nice feeling, actually.
Yes,
Because when you spend your life translating a very different kind of literature, sort of laws and technical documents,
Yes. Yeah.
and you get comfortable with that, then the idea of moving to something like poetry, and I've never been a big poetry reader, or I don't really have a literary background.
Yes.
I've not done huge amounts of real literary reading. So the idea of having to do something like that feels like a big step up, just to me anyway.
Yeah. Yes. No, well
so
done.
to have had that endorsement give me some confidence in it that I can perhaps do some more.
So when you're not translating legal documents or poetry and interpreting and being at Old Trafford, you're also a rock climber and a walker, a hill walker.
Yeah, growing up in Lancashire, we were never too far from the Peak District or North Wales or the Lake District. Get out in the hills and so go walking.
Yes.
So I've always done that.
Do you have your favourite place that you like to go walking in the UK?
I have actually. Right in the place where I grew up, just outside Bolton, there's a bit of the Pennines which sort of sticks into just above my hometown, and there's a hill there called Rivington Pike, which is sort of a small round-shaped hill with a little stone tower on the top of it.
Yeah.
And I've been climbing up that since I was a kid, and I've been up it dozens, hundreds of times across my life. Actually,
it knows all your stories.
It does. It's a very important place to me.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I suppose that's my favourite place.
And abroad, where would you go? Where's been somewhere that's really impressed you?
I've mainly hiked in Europe, actually, because a lot of the places I travel to are linked with the languages that I learn. I've ended up actually spending most of my travel and tourism time in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
I really like the hills and mountains of Eastern Europe. I was in the Tatra Mountains, which is on the border between Poland and Slovakia last summer, when there was a window when the infection rates went right down and they were...
Everyone escaped if you could.
And I managed to get away for a week of language classes in Poland. Then I took a week of holiday where I went hiking and climbing in the Tatra Mountains. And the Tatra Mountains.
Tatra Mountains, that's right.
They're the mountains on the border between Poland and the south of Poland and Slovakia. Yeah, I suppose if you could only go to one place, it might be there actually, because I'd be able to speak to the locals as well, and that's an important part of it, I find.
Yes. Have you ever gone anywhere where you haven't been able to speak the language? I mean, I know you mentioned doing your trips along the border, along the Iron Curtain route, and not speaking Italian, but actually gone to a country and just said, well, I know how to say hello, good morning, thank you, goodbye.
But no more than that.
No more than that.
Yeah.
Or do you feel uncomfortable being a language person doing that? Would you always make sure that you knew a bit more than that before you went somewhere?
I think I'm always conscious that there's a dimension of the potential experience that I'm missing out on if I don't have the language. I mean, that shouldn't stop you exploring places that you haven't been to before. You still get something from them.
Yeah.
I went to India and Bangladesh a few years ago with my dad. We went watching cricket, big cricket fans in our family, and so we went watching the England cricket team play in Bangladesh, and other than, of course, there's a level of English spoken there, but I couldn't speak in any of the local languages, so that was a place.
Oh, how was that as an experience?
That was I think it was my first real experience of Asia. That was quite something else. Yes, I mean, just an onslaught on the senses of sounds, colours, noises, sights.
Taste.
We went taste as well. Yes. We went to Chittagong, which is Bangladesh's second city, for the first match, and I think that was the first time I'd experienced Asia or the Indian subcontinent.
Yes, yeah.
The traffic, the number of people, I mean the poverty, the destitution, the violence as well. I saw people being beat up in the street, apparently for having stolen something very small. And there was a big crowd of people around them, and I said to somebody at the edge of the crowd, what's happening and what will happen? And oh yes, they will carry on beating them until they die.
Oh my goodness.
And this was on our first night there, so I went to try and find the police, and because what you do, yeah. The police seemed to think that was rather odd, that I wanted to go and get them to break up this beating that was going on.
Yeah. Did they?
Well, eventually yeah. I mean, it wasn't actually that far as the crow flies, and it was quite quick to walk there. But they insisted on going there in their vehicles, which in the local traffic, which was absolutely manic, I've never seen anything like it, was very slow.
Yeah.
And by the time we got there, it had all broken up. There was a few stragglers there, and the police asked what had been going on, and they told me that the two guys that were being beaten up had survived. And all this had been happening actually right at the front of a hospital, right outside a hospital. And apparently they were both in the hospital, but they had both survived.
How extraordinary.
Yeah, so it was the first experience.
Yeah.
That's a place where there was enough English that I was able to do all that.
Yeah.
Even though I would love to have been able to speak the local language. I guess I've been to Arabic-speaking countries a couple of times, Jordan and the UEA. And I don't know any Arabic at all.
Yes. For a holiday, perhaps?
Yes. One of them was another cricket trip. The England cricket team was
You
playing
really
against Pakistan. Yes.
Fanatic.
Yes. Yeah. No, I do love cricket. And a holiday to Jordan was just a holiday to see the country.
Yes, yeah.
And
a
week in the UAE to watch the England cricket team play the Pakistani cricket team, because at the time they couldn't play in Pakistan because of the terrorist threat to visiting players.
Right.
I went to Korea at the end of 2019. I went to Japan for a language conference, and it coincided with the Rugby World Cup.
Oh wow!
So
that
and
was good timing.
I got tickets for a couple of the rugby matches.
Yes.
And as part of that trip, I went to Korea for the first time. And even though I'd learned evening classes a little bit of Korean a few years previously, I remember zero of it. So, yeah, that was a place I couldn't communicate at all. English is prevalent enough, isn't it, that you can get by anywhere.
Yes.
But like I say, I always know there's more experience that can be had if you've got even sometimes just a little bit of the language.
Just a smattering of language,
yeah.
Yes. So you've done a lot of travels around the world. I mean, it's a big place, the world, obviously. But from all the places that you've visited, is there one place that's had a huge impact on you?
I think it would be Slovakia, I think, for the reasons I was saying earlier about I ended up going there at a very formative time in my life, and I learned a lot about myself and about the world, realised that I was a lot more naive than I had realised. And it shaped what I've ended up doing as an adult for my career in terms of working now with the language every day as a translator. But also I did a bit of journalism there, and I was a journalist for 10 years before I went back into translation, so it was the experience that I got there that helped me get into a journalism job later. So I would say that place has had the most impact on me.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things from just talking to you is that home has been so many different places for you over the years. It appears. So where do you consider home? Do you feel it's here, or is it Europe? Do you feel more European? Do you feel more British? Do you feel neither?
Well, that's a good post-Brexit question, isn't it?
Yes.
I feel both. I still feel very proud to be British, just about.
Yes.
I still feel very attached to Britain and the UK. I do feel European. I'm not sure I would put European ahead of a British identity. I know a lot of people's reaction to what's happened with the last few years with the Brexit vote and now leaving the EU is for them to have preferred a European identity. I still try and juggle both.
Yes.
I still call home, I still refer to my hometown, Bolton, as home. I'm lucky that my parents are still alive and still live there.
Yes.
And my brother is there, so it's sort of where I was born and brought up, where when there isn't a pandemic on, where I go back still fairly often. It's where I feel my identity is rooted there, even though I haven't lived there for many, many years.
Yes.
You know, I'm probably one of these people that gets very patriotic or nostalgic and sentimental about a place, you know, only because you're not there anymore.
Yeah. But when you do go back, is it a case that you just feel more comfortable, and it's almost like, because everything's so familiar, you don't really have to think about everything because you know where everything is?
Yeah, I feel it's my home area. I like knowing the place. You sort of tune into the way people speak. It's familiar linguistically, culturally. On the other hand, the fact that I spent most of my life away, the fact that I was drawn to want to explore the world away from there and end up living away from there means there's a part of me that's maybe not 100% comfortable there.
Yes.
You know, sometimes when I go back and I do sense that I'm now an outsider, or I've had experiences that make me an outsider. And if I had to go back and live there permanently, well, number one, I'm not sure what work I would get at this point, but I might end up having a very different perception of it.
Yeah.
From the perspective of being able to live in London or Brussels once the pandemic finishes, but then to visit back that area, to see family and so on often, in that situation it does feel comfortably home. Beyond that, I'm not sure where I would feel home. London, Brussels and Slovakia are the places I've spent the longest, and they each feel a bit like home in different ways.
Yeah. Home is for me it's such a difficult thing to identify where home is. It's I think for me it's where you feel comfortable at the present time, and my home is many places for me. I don't think it's ever going to be one place. I think it's nice, and I'm comfortable with that, and I'm glad I can be like that. That you can just take it as it is, and you can go somewhere and just embrace it and think, oh, that's actually home. Even if you can't speak the language, I can sometimes be places where it just feels, for that moment in time, it's home for me. I know that's harder for other people to comprehend.
It might be elements of a culture or something that feel good to you or that you have an affinity with.
Yes,
or something.
exactly. There's something there, and you can't always put your finger on what actually it is that makes you feel at home, but it just does. You know.
Yeah.
In Bolton, do people that you know back home, do they think that you have a London accent now, or do they think you're still a Bolton boy?
I'm not sure.
Because I can hear your accent, but I wonder whether.
I'm not sure about London. I'm not as strong as my brother or my father would be, for instance, who've spent their whole lives there.
Yes.
And of course, the accent starts to get stronger the longer I stay there. Whether that's subconscious or conscious, I don't know. But I mean, people still come to me. I mean, not when I'm back in Bolton, but around, and they say, "Oh, you must be from up north somewhere." So it's obviously still there, but I think it's been very sort of filtered and squashed and squished into different directions. Yeah, I think so. There's still some vowels which are very diagnostic of where I come from, like the vowel in the word vowel. Which I seem not to be able to get rid of, even if I wanted to.
And does that come out in when you speak Polish?
Oh, good question. I don't know, actually. No, I think I've always been. I think one thing about learning languages is being a good mimic, and I've always been a fairly good mimic of other accents.
Yes.
Accents in English, for instance. So my mother's from Ireland originally, and most of my relatives. She's from a big family. So most of the relatives, cousins and uncles and aunts, are Irish.
Yes.
And so from very young we were exposed to people speaking with Irish accents, very distinctive, beautiful, wonderful language.
Yes.
And I don't know whether that sensitized me to understanding, interpreting, getting used to different accents and then being able to reproduce them.
Okay.
I mean, I've never spoken in an Irish accent naturally, but I'm not. I can put on the accent, and I can sort of I'm fairly good at doing accents, and I think then when I'm learning other languages, I'm quite good at then mimicking the accent of that language. So I'm quite good at speaking Polish in a Polish accent.
Okay, so
but the problem is when I start making grammatical mistakes, and then if you're speaking to a Polish person, they think, hang on, this person sounds Polish, but they're making terrible mistakes that no Polish person would ever make. What on earth's going on here?
Yes,
and that's the problem. If you can fool people by mimicking the accent well, you can fool them into thinking that they know your language, and then often they will then start sort of speaking much quicker than they would do, and using vocabulary that you don't know, and then it becomes obvious to them. Oh, actually, no, you're not Polish, are you? Of course you're not Polish.
So you had them fooled for a second, or a few seconds even.
When I lived in Slovakia, I got, at the end of the 3.5 years, I had got to a point where my vocabulary and understanding were good enough, and my accent, I'd always been able to do the accent quite well. I did get to the point where people thought I was Slovak, a local, and if they thought there was something a bit weird about how I spoke, then they thought maybe I was from a particular region of Slovakia that they were, or from the east, usually, because in the east of Slovakia they speak in a slightly different way, so they might usually think, oh, he's from the east somewhere. And then, of course, the longer I spoke, then it would eventually become clear to them that, oh no, he's actually a foreigner that's just learned the language.
Yes.
But it's a nice feeling when you get to that level.
Yes, that people just automatically believe you to be kind of one of them, as it were.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, Paul, we've been talking for quite a long time. I've been asking you loads of questions, but is there anything that you wanted me to ask you that I haven't asked you?
Yeah, we've ranged over a lot of things. It's been really enjoyable chat. Well, I mentioned in the introduction that we might talk about cross-country skiing, only that's something else that
Where did you learn cross-country skiing?
I'm interested in doing, and it's also sort of potential for a book project as well. So
okay, yes, please go ahead. It's something I only ever tried once, and I was absolutely terrible at it, but I feel I should have another go at it. But maybe you should.
It's great fun. I've always liked running.
Yes. And
hiking and being in woods and in mountains. And cross-country skiing combines all that, the best of that. Well, and I also, when I do it, which is not very often, I also like downhill skiing.
Yes.
And cross-country skiing just combines all those things, and it's really enjoyable. When I lived in Slovakia, just north of the city of Bratislava, there's a range of hills called the Male Karpaty, the Lesser Carpathians, and used to go hiking in those hills, and it gets a lot of snow in the winter.
Yes.
And we were on a hike one day, and we saw this guy cross-country skiing through the woods, and I'd never really, I kind of had seen and knew about cross-country skiing, but in the UK we don't,
it's not enough.
It's not something that we do really, is it?
No.
And perhaps in parts of Scotland. And I said, oh, that looks good. So I went down to the shop, bought some cross-country skis, and sort of strapped them on, got the bus up to the top of the trail up in the edge of the city where the hills started, and started doing some cross-country skiing. And then when I moved to Belgium, so I lived in Belgium for many years, believe it or not, when it snows in Belgium, on the eastern part of the country, there's high ground in the Ardennes on the border with Germany, which is actually ideal for cross-country skiing.
Okay.
So there's actually a lot of good cross-country ski trails when it snows, which isn't every year. So the years that I lived in Belgium, every year or two, I'd be able to go and do a couple of outings on my skis.
Yes.
And I enjoyed it because it was like going for a hike or a run in these lovely wooded, forested environments. And then I thought, maybe I should get a bit more serious about it. So I signed up and did a week's holiday in a proper cross-country ski area in Italy a few years ago with the tutor and everything, and it was fantastic. And I got myself some new skis, and since then I've taken it fairly seriously and started to do some cross-country ski races, so the equivalent of like marathons in running.
Yes.
There are these cross-country ski marathons. There's a circuit you can do. So lots of different countries that have a tradition of cross-country skiing, they each have a long-distance race.
Right.
And these have been put into a series, and if you compete, or if you finish 10 of these races, there's about 20 countries that hold one of these races, and if you do 10 of them, then there's a little passport thing that they produce, and you get a little stamp for each one you do.
Okay.
And when you reach 10 stamps, you're declared to be a cross-country master, I think they called it. That's what I'm trying to do at the moment, is
brilliant.
Do enough of these cross-country ski races to get my stamps in this little passport, so I can call myself a cross-country ski master. I'm not very fast. I always finish very close to the bottom. But
you finish.
But I finish, and I enjoy it. That's the main thing. I just really enjoy
It's meant to be incredibly good for your health as well, isn't it? It's a good workout.
It's really good. Yeah, it's good whole body workout. You use your upper body because you're pushing on the poles as well as pushing off with your legs as well.
Yes. Yeah.
It's really good exercise. And when you get into a rhythm, you reach a speed where you're going faster than walking.
Yes.
If you're really good, you go faster than running. I can't quite go as faster than I would do if I was running, except on the downhill sections.
Yes.
But cross-country skiing's got lots of uphill sections as well as downhills.
Yes.
But you get into a rhythm, and it's a really lovely feeling physically of being sort of in a groove of moving at this lovely, nice rhythmic pace. So I really enjoy it. It's just a shame, over the last year I haven't been able to do any.
Yes.
I did one race in Austria in January last year, and I was hoping to do another 2 or even 3 last season. The season's usually about sort of December to April. But I couldn't do any more, obviously. And then this year, most of them have been cancelled or called off. And actually, they're starting to organise virtual cross-country ski races. So you can still take part in these races, even though they're not happening.
Yeah.
You do it in your own country and in your own area.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you don't have snow, then you're allowed to do it by bicycle or roller ski. So roller skiing, I don't know if you've seen it.
That's quite a big thing in Hyde Park, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's roller skiing.
Yeah, and when I moved to London, that's actually where I started to get a bit more serious about the cross-country skiing. I joined up with the people who do roller skiing in Hyde Park and learned how to do that. And it looks weird, and whenever you go around there, you get funny looks from people walking in the park, and they ask you, "What's that then?" You use the poles like you would do for skiing, and you use the same boots and the same bindings as your skis, just exactly the same boots.
Yes.
But then instead of long skis, it's sort of a thing. It's a couple of feet long, or 1.5 foot, with one small wheel at either end. It's like a very long rollerblade.
Okay.
A long and thin rollerblade, and your boot is attached to it, and your heel is free.
Yes.
Like in cross-country skis, and it really mimics the action of cross-country skiing really well.
Okay.
And it does train all the parts of the body that you need to train.
Okay.
So I've done a lot more of that really the last few years than actually on snow.
Yes. When there was snow in London for the one day that it was here, did you have your skis with you to go out and...
I haven't. I've got my roller skis, but my skis are actually stranded in Brussels at the moment.
Oh, are they? Oh,
yeah,
no.
so there was part of me wishing it would snow a lot because I love snow.
Yes.
And there was part of me thinking, I hope it doesn't snow too much, because
you haven't got your
like
skis
over the nearly 7 years that I've been living in London, I've always wanted it to snow enough that I could. What I really wanted to do was to ski to work. That would have been the best.
Yes.
And I thought that would be so frustrating if it actually happens when I don't have my skis. There was a couple of years ago, I don't know if you remember, when it was we had a heavy snowfall.
Yes, yes.
And I put the skis on, and I got as far as the main road, Kennington Road, and I thought I was going to be able to get all the way to the office, but Kennington Road was just not. It was not deep enough. The cars had already churned it up a bit too much. So I turned back.
Yeah.
So I didn't manage to get all the way to work that time.
At least you tried.
Yeah, but our square is quite quiet and doesn't get much road traffic, so I was able to go around the square a few times.
Yes, yeah.
And I've been using the roller skis to do a bit of exercise round our square as well, and round Hyde Park. I've seen people in this park doing roller skiing a few times.
It's something to try, I think. I'll add it to the list of things to try.
Yeah.
So in the meantime, we have circumnavigated Battersea Park probably about 3 or 4 times while we've been chatting away, and it's been lovely talking to you, Paul, and just catching up, because it's been a while since we've seen each other.
Yeah, it's been a while. It's been great to see you. Yeah.
And are you around for the next book club? You're in a Travelling Through book club?
Yes, the next book club, we're talking about Poland and Polish writers. We're reading Joseph Conrad.
Yes.
The Secret Agent.
Yeah.
And I just opened it last night to
Did
start
you?
reading it.
Oh, well done.
Yes, I'll hopefully be at the next book club.
Fantastic. Okay,
Yeah.
well, I hope to see you there. I haven't been around as much, but perhaps I will get there this month. I haven't read it yet, so possibly not. But there we go. And the sun is just starting to break through now, typically as we finish, but it's been
a few signs of it, isn't there?
Yes.
And the river has come right up, hasn't it? I mean, not all the way, but it's higher than it was when we set off.
Yeah.
I think.
Fantastic. Well, as a parting shot, if you had to recommend to our podcast listeners the most appropriate language to learn in the world today, which one would you choose?
Oh gosh, that's a question.
Sorry, I just put you on the spot there.
I think it would have to. It's whichever language is spoken in a country or by a culture that you feel an affinity with, a place you want to go, a place and a culture you want to know better.
Yes.
Make that what decides which language you choose, because that way you'll stick with it.
Yeah.
You'll have a reason to want to carry on learning it, because it will start to unlock that country and that culture.
Yes.
And hopefully you'll have a positive feedback effect. The more you learn, the more you then want to learn.
Yes.
That's if you're learning it for pleasure. If it's learning for strictly professional purposes and it's just, okay, if I just want to use it for a job and to make the most money, which language should I learn? That's a tough one as well, isn't it? Maybe Spanish, maybe German.
Okay.
We still do a lot of business with Germany. Spanish, we get a lot of contact with different parts of the world, South America as well as Spain. Russian, maybe. And probably Mandarin Chinese,
Yeah.
given that China is only going to become
Yes.
more
yes.
and more important
So
in our lives.
quite a few languages to
Yeah,
choose
you've got
between.
you've got plenty to work on
Yes,
there
no,
for a while.
definitely.
A few lifetimes worth. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you so much, Paul, for being on the podcast.
You're welcome.
And
Thank you
to
for
all
inviting me.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. And to all you podcast listeners out there, I hope it's been inspiring for you and you've enjoyed listening to Paul's story of London, the world and life in his life so far. Please do share the podcast, subscribe, leave us a review if you can. We'll be back again next week with another podcast. But until then, take care and thanks for listening.